The landing of WACS, EASSy, SEACOM and SAT3 on the African continent has heralded a new dawn for connectivity in Africa. As lack of bandwidth has arrested development on the continent, the cables are a welcome boost. Now joining me in studio to discuss the role and the impact of these undersea cables is Dobek Pater, ICT Analyst, Africa Analysis, and Aidan Baigrie, Head of Business Development at SEACOM, and Edwin Thompson, GM of Technology and Infrastructure at MTN Business. Gentlemen, thank you so much and welcome to the program. Right, so we've been taking a look at Africa's undersea cables. WACS, is it truly open? The benefits for landing partners and pushing broadband in Africa, and of course the financial impact of undersea cables. It is all about the Africa agenda. We have 1 billion people on the continent, and we know that penetration is very low. We've got around 11% usage when it comes to internet, and most of it is mobile at this point. And here we've got fantastic infrastructure that is the undersea cables that I've been alluding to. The question is, have we made enough headway, and is it enough? And I'd like to start off with you, Edwin. Where are we right now when it comes to the physical infrastructure?
Look, I think from a physical infrastructure perspective, we're a long way down the line. We have for quite a while had West Coast cable capacity through the SAT3 cable infrastructure. That was a very closed infrastructure. Subsequent to that, we saw the next big break being the SEACOM infrastructure coming in. That added quite a lot of capacity to the continent. Again, subsequent to that, we have seen the EASSy cable coming in, which has helped us tremendously. And the big excitement is around, of course, the WACS cable, because that is a very, very large cable system, the biggest we've seen in Africa.
And the big question is it truly open? And you were alluding to the first cable being closed. Could you elaborate the differences between open and closed?
Okay, most cable systems are formed in different structures. The most common is a consortium-based cable, where consortium members have pretty much, shall we call it, carte blanche to landing stations and so on. You then have investor-type cable systems where someone is simply selling capacity, which are more open, but you don't actually own the capacity yourself. And then you have cable systems like the WACS cable, which has come along, which is kind of a mix. It's a consortium-based cable, but it has open landing stations to it. And what that effectively means is that the consortium members can actually sell their capacity into other countries where they may not be licensed, and a licensed operator in that specific country may actually pick up that operator's capacity from that landing station, even if they're not a consortium member.
Okay, so Aidan, I think it's a very good definition in terms of where we are and where we're headed going forward. We've also seen the advent of new infrastructure coming through from a mobile perspective, but do you think that there is a very important space for localized infrastructure, and I'm alluding to undersea cables?
Look, I think, there's a huge need for the undersea cables, and I think we're still seeing them coming on shore, and I think the results of that are going to be very positive, and we'll probably chat about it later in the show. Just one comment I wanted to have in relation to the concept of open access. For me, the concept of open access is about a neutral platform whereby capacity is made available to all parties in terms of the products and the pricing at an equal level. So for me, I think people confuse the open access principle with just saying, oh, we sell to everyone, we don't turn down customers. I think if you look at the WACS cable, for example, you've got consortium-based members in there who have access to huge amounts of bandwidth at a fraction of the price that they will be retailed for after landing. So you sort of look at the overall picture and you say, okay, well, obviously the first point is who are those consortium members, and in South Africa it's Vodacom, MTN, Telkom, and the government. The usual suspects from a traditional incumbent or tier one sort of perspective. The second thing is saying, well, are they accessing at the same price? No. As you are investees into the consortium cable, you've got great access to super cheap bandwidth that other people won't have access to. So while you are selling to everyone, and I'm saying you, but I'm saying for WACS specifically, for me that doesn't really sort of qualify as open access how I would determine it.
Okay, so you don't think that WACS qualifies as open access, and of course you are right in many senses, but then again, the shareholders that you've alluded to have actually pumped money into ensuring that this SEACOM cable was actually, well, the WACS cable arrived to the continent.
Absolutely.
And I think MTN's investment was $90 million, if I'm not mistaken. So Dobek, you're sitting on the sidelines. Is WACS open or not?
I'd agree with Aidan to a degree. You have vested interest from the consortium members. Obviously, they took the risk, they carried the risk, but because they funded the cable and made it happen, they also then have the privilege of being able to access the less costly, the cheaper bandwidth in that cable, and then sell it to whoever is willing to pay the price, and the price will be ultimately determined by market forces. And you know, sort of at a top level, but then we've got long-term agreements and depending who enters into what agreement with the sellers, the operators. So in that sense, SEACOM is the only really open access cable in the sense that it's owned by people who are not telcos, who don't use that bandwidth for their own purposes to provide services in the market on their networks, and it sells to anyone that it enters into agreements with on a more or less even footing, let's say, if you know, whether you operate A or B, as long as you meet a certain sort of type of conditions in terms of length of agreement and so forth, then you pay sort of the same price, let's say, more or less.
Okay, so Edwin, what is your view on this?
Well,
I mean, you see it as an open cable, but it seems that could be disputed.
I would actually disagree. I would say actually WACS is a more open cable system. If you're comparing it, you're looking at a cable system with a single investor, all right, and therefore your price point is effectively controlled by a single entity. In the WACS cable system, where you have multiple investors in the cable system, it means that those investors can effectively compete with one another. So provided you've got open access to the actual landing station, which we do in the consortium agreement, the fact is that you now have a number of investors in a cable system who can compete with one another. And there's 6
investors, if I'm not mistaken.
No, there's 12 investors in the WACS cable system. So you've actually got 12 investors which can compete with each other in each other's turf effectively, which I think is probably qualifies as more open access than a single investor.
But is it truly open then? Because I think that is what agents
You are the investors. The investors are the incumbents in the countries who now compete with each other, and we've seen this with SAT3. Obviously the incumbent invests in the cable, and as a result they get access to the bandwidth. But you're still sharing the bandwidth amongst an elite few, I guess, is the point I'm making, as opposed to opening it up.
So there's no room for the smaller
at a level playing field
to have a benefit to see the benefits of much cheaper access.
Well, that decision is with the MTN can make that decision to make the bandwidth available at whatever price they choose. The point is the choice is now being made by someone who has their own vested interest, in theory.
Okay.
I think the point may be, in fact, it may no longer be a point of discussion a couple of years down the line once we've got all the cables landed and delivering, because ultimately market forces will determine the price. And if we have overabundance of capacity, which may happen, operators, some of them may be willing to sell below cost just to get rid of the bandwidth, because otherwise they sit with a cost they've already incurred and they're not recuperating that. It's not a profitable business for them, or they're not even recouping the cost that they've invested into the cable. So they may, so to speak, dump the bandwidth into the market just to be able to sell it.
So the total cost for WACS, $600 million. We know that, as I mentioned before, MTN has pumped $90 million into this. When do you expect to see returns on this investment?
Look, I mean, returns on the investment is going to be longer term. We're seeing the cable light up early next year. So obviously we'll start seeing the benefits of the cable system already then. Obviously the full return on investment is a long-term investment. These cable systems are designed to stay in the sea many, many years. And obviously as the cable systems are upgraded, more and more capacity is put on them, and therefore more benefit out of that investment is seen.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously when it comes to the life cycle of a business, perhaps then, Aidan, you could come up and say, well, this is when you've got to give access to everyone at a much cheaper level after you've seen the returns on of your investment, or do you think that it should happen way before then?
Look, I think I'm a commercial person at heart, and at the end of the day, the economics need to make sense to the shareholders, and I don't think there should be rules in place that you have to do your return on investment before you drop pricing, etc., etc. I think market forces, like Dobek said, will play their role in ensuring what happens. It's just it's the interesting journey, I guess, and the sort of the core of this discussion today as to what is going to happen, how is it going to play out, what is going to be the impact of these cables coming in.
Well, I mean, when we keep hearing about the cables coming to Africa, the end consumer is not really feeling the ultimate effect of speed and more access. And we know that we still, I mean, if you're downloading a YouTube video, if you're doing a Skype video call, I mean, at this point in time, we're still waiting to see more technological advances. Dobek, what is the gap that needs to be breached right now, or bridged at this point in time? Because a few years ago, perhaps 15 years ago, we were talking about having uninterrupted voice access that was streamlined, and now today we're talking about speed and full access to data as opposed to voice.
Before I answer that, maybe I think I don't completely agree with it. I think we've already seen improvements in download speeds, certainly in capacity available. That's why telecoms going from 1 megabit per second to 4 megabit per second to 10 megabit per second download connections now. Mobile operators are going from HSDPA to HSPA plus to LTE, ultimately multiplying by factors of magnitude the download speeds that will be available to consumers. And the price is a bit of a different issue, because international bandwidth, the international cables that have landed and will still land, account for maybe 20% of the total cost of providing that service to the end user. So there are other 80% that account for that cost as well, and these costs are not necessarily coming down at this point, which sort of comes back to your question. We can divide the network into 4 elements: the international component, national component in between cities and the landing stations and big, say, hubs or switching centers, and then metropolitan network, which are the rings around the cities, and from then the last mile, the actual link, whether it's wireless or wireline, that links you to the customers to the network. And the constraints still lie in the access network, the last mile. They've been alleviated to a large extent in metropolitan, most of the metros, but on national routes, and South Africa is a different case to some of the other African markets. Not always better, but our markets are far worse off than South Africa is.
Especially the landlocked countries in a sense in Africa, absolutely.
So the constraints still lie in other parts of the network or other components, even if the international bandwidth that problem has been solved. And that's where the cost constraints and capacity constraints may lie.
Okay, on that high note, we're going to take a very short break. When we return, we'll be delving more into the last mile and some of the constraints we could see within the sector. More telco talk when we come back, so stay tuned.